This UCSD TV program is presented by University of California Television. Like what you learn? Visit our website or follow us on Facebook and Twitter to keep up with the latest programs.
Good evening and welcome to the Birch Aquarium at Scripps Institution of Oceanography at UC San Diego. My name is Nigella Hilgarth. I'm the Executive Director. And I want to tell you that this is the very first of our new occasional lecture series at the Birch Aquarium, Magnificent Ocean. And these talks really focus on the amazing diversity of life in the sea. And so I think it's very appropriate that Joshua Stewart, who is a PhD student at Scripps Institution of Oceanography, working with Dr. Bryce Simmons, is going to actually start the evening off, the first lecture in this series. Joshua is an associate director of the Manta Trust, which is a non-profit dedicated to studying and conserving manta rays and their close relatives. And Joshua began studying manta rays in the Maldives during his year as a Rolex scholar. I presume that's Rolex watches. And he's now researching the population dynamics and the spatial ecology of oceanic manta rays in the Indo-Pacific for his dissertation. And prior to his work with manta rays, Joshua was focused on marine protected area design and other issues related to marine conservation. And in addition to his research, he is very involved in education and public outreach. And he includes writing articles on marine conservation and research, more often than not on manta rays, which is not a surprise. Please join me in welcoming Joshua for his talk, Manta Rays, Majestic and Threatened Icons.
Thanks very much. All right. Thank you. Thanks, Nigella, for the introduction, and thanks to all of you for coming tonight. So hopefully all the beautiful images of mantas up there have you all mesmerized, and my job for the rest of the evening is going to be pretty easy. So I just want to start off the talk with everything you ever wanted to know about manta rays. So we'll go through all the basics, and then later on I'll talk about my research here at Scripps on oceanic mantas. But to get started, let's just talk about what manta rays are. So whenever I tell people that I work with mantas, they often say, oh wow, that must be so dangerous. You know, Steve Irwin got killed by one of those. And it's actually a completely different species, but it's related to stingrays. And so when we hear the word ray, we usually think of what's up on the screen here, stingrays, skates. We also have electric rays, torpedo rays, and guitar rays. And these make up the majority of the ray family. And what they all share in common is that they're benthic dwellers, so they live on the bottom, they eat crustaceans and other organisms that live in the sand, and they have these specially designed jaws that are made for crushing shellfish. Okay, and so these animals are really tied to the seafloor. Now if we take another evolutionary step, we've got the Myliobatidae, and these are also stingrays. They have barbs, they're capable of stinging people. But they've developed more of a pelagic lifestyle. So they're all shaped in this sort of diamond shape. They're capable of swimming, free swimming up in the water column. But these species that we see here, the eagle rays, the cownose rays, bat rays, despite the fact that they're capable of making migrations and swimming through the water column, they still retain these crushing jaws. So they still feed benthically. And they share that in common with stingrays and torpedo rays and skates. And they're capable of sitting on the bottom for extended periods. They can flush water over their gills. So despite the fact that they've developed the ability to swim quite well, they're still tied in a way to the seafloor. Now, if we take one more evolutionary step, now we're at the Mobulidae, which are another species or a family of rays. And this includes mobulas, which there are about 9 species of, and of course manta rays, which is the focus of our talk tonight. And these species are different than the rest of the stingrays and other rays because they have a truly pelagic lifestyle. So they are completely free swimming, they never spend time on the bottom, and in fact, they can only breathe by swimming. So they have to spend their entire life constantly in motion. Okay? So we have 9 species of mobulas and at least 2 species of manta rays. On top here, the Oceanic manta ray, and on the bottom, the Reef manta ray. And we think that there's going to be one more species, at least, described in the Caribbean. So manta rays can be found all around the world. In yellow up here is the species distribution for oceanic manta rays in particular. And we also have reef mantas inhabiting essentially the same habitat. The only difference is that there aren't any reef manta rays in the Atlantic, and we don't find reef manta rays east of Hawaii in the Pacific. So all along the Americas, down in Baja, all we see there are oceanic manta rays. And despite the fact that these animals live in a lot of the same areas, one of the reasons that they were only described as 2 different species as recently as 2009 is because they actually live in very different habitats. So reef manta rays, as the name suggests, live on coral reefs for the most part, while oceanic mantas live in more pelagic open water habitats. They're often found on seamounts, shelf breaks, that sort of thing. And so because these species were never or not very often seen next to each other, we didn't really realize how different they are from each other up until very recently. But with a little bit of practice, to the trained eye, we can tell the difference between the 2 species. So some of the really obvious morphological differences are very easily visually identified. So on the left we have reef manta rays, on the right we have oceanic manta rays. One of the first obvious differences you see are these white shoulder patches, the dorsal coloration. So on reef manta rays they form this sort of V shape, while on oceanic manta rays they have this really defined T right here. And so that's one of the first things where if you see a manta ray and you're wondering what species it is, if you take a look at the dorsal coloration, it should give you a pretty good idea. And then also the markings on the bottom or the ventral surface of the mantas also tell us what species they are. So while reef manta rays have these spots all throughout, up between their gill rakers and all along their body, oceanic mantas only have these spots below their gill slits, and they have these much darker bands as well. So these are the 2 tools that we use to identify the 2 species. And we can also, to some degree, use size as a differentiating feature. So reef manta rays top out, they're still pretty large, between 4 and 5 meters. So the maximum is probably around 4.5 meters, with most reef mantas coming in around 3 meters. So that's about 10 to 12 feet across. That's a really big animal. But they're dwarfed by oceanic manta rays, which can come in as big as 7 meters across. So that's around 22 or 23 feet across. So that's about as big as between 2 of these pillars here, right? And so this isn't the best photo, but I think the perspective really gives you a sense of what it's like to be in the water and have one of these animals swim up to you. So this is an oceanic manta ray, and this guy is only maybe around 4.5 meters across. So they get quite a bit bigger than this. And this guy right here was caught in the early 20th century off New Jersey, and he's about 6 meters across. So they're absolutely massive animals, all right? Very large, and with that big body size, we also have really large brains, okay? So brain to body mass ratio is a metric that we use to help describe the intelligence of an animal. And it's not a perfect metric, but it gives us a pretty good idea of what sort of capacity this animal has, how intelligent it could be. And mammals traditionally have a very high brain to body mass ratio. We're really smart. Fishes, on the other hand, usually have a pretty low brain to body mass ratio. Meanwhile, elasmobranchs, which are all sharks and rays, come in quite a bit higher than other species of fish, bony fishes, teleosts. and some of them are even in the range of mammals, and that's where manta rays fall. So mantas have the largest brain to body mass ratio of any fish in the ocean, and that's a really good indicator that they're very smart. But we've got other evidence to suggest that they're more intelligent than you might suspect just from the brain to body mass ratio. So mantas, despite being a cold-blooded animal, also have brain warming mechanisms. So they have what we call countercurrent heat exchange systems, which allows certain areas of their brain to be warmed, which allows for more activity. And we also know that certain parts of the brain of the manta are highly developed. And these are the areas that we usually associate in humans with complex problem solving, social structure, and memory. Okay, so these are all pretty good indicators that these are really smart animals. So they're large, they're smart, they're also very long-lived. So you can see here, this is one individual that was identified in 1989. And it's worth mentioning that when it was first identified, it was already a sexually mature female, which happens between 5 and 10 years. And here it is again in 2012. So this manta ray is older than I am. And we have lots and lots of evidence to suggest that these mantas probably live more than 50 years. And that's the case for both species. And the way we were identifying this same manta many years apart are with the spot pattern on its belly. So every manta ray has a unique spot pattern, and that pattern doesn't change throughout its life, so we use it sort of like a fingerprint for that animal. And because we can identify individual animals, we can look at things like population sizes in certain areas. We can also track how these animals are moving around different sites if we receive photographs from divers at dive sites, or if we actually go out and collect those photographs. And we can also look at things like birth rates and pregnancy rates. And based on that, so this is a pregnant manta over here. So based on monitoring pregnancies and looking at how often individuals get pregnant, we also know that depending on the area, manta rays give birth every 2 to 5 years. All right, and I've never been pregnant, so I can't speak from experience, but I think that pregnancies also hurt their backs, right? And so on the right here, we have some more evidence of mating, which we use to look at sexual maturity and how often these animals give birth. These are mating scars, and we'll talk in a second about how they get these scars. So after a gestation period or a pregnancy of 12 to 13 months, mantas pop out a little manta burrito, and they're about 1.5 to 2 meters across when they come out. So they're already really big, and they're completely self-sufficient. So that's how mantas differ from mammals. When the baby comes out, off it goes on its own. There's no parental care that we know of. And you might be wondering where manta babies, manta burritos come from. And so when a male manta loves a female manta, he and 10 of his friends get together and chase her around the reef. And so in that way, they're very similar to humans, right? And so what you see up here is the large female manta, and she's being chased intentionally by, I think there are 6 potential suitors here. And what happens is this female will lead all of these males on sort of a Darwinian survival of the fittest race. And so she races around the reef, she dodges in and out of obstacles. If there are divers around, they'll actually weave in between the divers. And what she's looking for is the male that can stick with her for the longest time, all right? And so finally, she narrows it down to one male, and this lucky male bites on to almost always her left pectoral fin, all right? And so you can see him doing that here, and this is actually where the mating scars come from. And then they flip belly to belly, and as I said before, mantas are always swimming, so they're actually negatively buoyant. So when they start mating, they actually fall down in the water column. So they swim up fairly high, close to the surface, and then they only have a few seconds to mate, also like humans, and down they come, finishing up before they hit the bottom. So these mating trains that we see here are often mistaken for feeding trains. And so, you know, in all fairness, they look very similar, but they're doing 2 very different things. So mantas always swimming, when they feed, they open up their mouths and they unroll their cephalic fins to help channel water into their mouths. And they're actually feeding on some of the smallest organisms in the ocean. So mantas are planktivores, and like a lot of other very large animals in the ocean, whales, whale sharks, they've evolved to feed on some of the smallest animals. So they generally feed on small copepods, crustaceans like euphausiids and krill, sometimes small fish, but that's mostly other mobula species. And they have some amazing feeding behaviors. So they'll surface ram feed like this, where they basically swim along a slick on the surface of zooplankton. And if they find a particularly rich patch, they'll do these barrel rolls, where they can basically target the same plankton again and again. And then the explanation for this for this feeding train here is that zooplankton don't have many defensive mechanisms, but they have some predator avoidance mechanisms, mainly that they can jump very quickly in one direction or another. So if something's swimming towards them that they think is going to eat them, they tend to jump up very quickly or down very quickly. And so you can imagine if you have a chain of 5 or 6 mantas all behind and above each other, when these plankton in front of this first guy jump up, he's going right into the second manta's mouth, right? So this is another example of a pretty complex social behavior that hints at a pretty advanced level of intelligence for the species. Now, they've also got some spectacular group feeding behavior. So this happens only in one place that we know of, which is in the Maldives, in Hanafaru Lagoon. And based on the currents, the tides, the monsoon, and this particular geological formation, you have, during slack tide, really high concentrations of copepods and other zooplankton. And this attracts literally hundreds of manta rays. So you can have, in one really big feeding event, up to 250 reef mantas, each of which, again, is between 2 and 4 meters across. And they have this amazing vortex feeding behavior, where they all actually get together and they form a cyclone which reaches from the surface all the way down to the bottom of the bay, which is about 20 meters or 60 feet below, and they just circle continuously. And if you're sitting on the outside of this vortex, you can actually feel yourself being sucked in a little bit. So it creates a current. And we think that this is actually an intentional behavior that helps concentrate all of the zooplankton in the bay to maximize the feeding effectiveness. So again, hinting at a pretty advanced species, right? So they're not your average fish. So they feed on the smallest organisms in the ocean, and that allows them to get very large. And as a result, they have very few natural predators, but they do have a few predators, right? And mainly, it's sharks. And so you can see here, and depending on the region, in regions with lots of sharks, like Mozambique, we see lots of animals that have these shark bites. Okay, but these tend to not be fatal predation events. Okay, the mantas usually get out alive, albeit with a little bit of a reminder of the incident. There are also some documented predation events from orcas or killer whales, and those tend to be fatal. They don't get out as unscathed from those. But when they do come out all right, they have an amazing capacity to heal. So this is one individual here, and obviously she's not doing so well. And just a year later, this image was taken of the same manta, and you can see that that shark bite has almost completely healed over in about the span of a year. All right, so they're very hardy animals. They're able to heal very quickly from pretty significant trauma. Now, when they have these shark bites, they need to keep them clean somehow. So they tend to come into what we call cleaning stations, and both species do this. And lots of reef fish and pelagic species, everything in the ocean for the most part, uses cleaning stations. And essentially a cleaning station is a patch of reef where you have specific fish that will come up and pick parasites off of individual mantas or sharks or groupers, other reef fish. So this is a video from the Maldives. And cleaning doesn't only occur when mantas have wounds, open wounds, although it does help keep them relatively clean. They just come in sort of as a regular part of life. And so here you can see all of these reef fish coming up, and they're picking parasites off of the manta's skin. And you'll also see in a second here that the mantas will even open up their mouths and let these cleaner fish swim in and clean the insides of their mouths as well. And so here you're also getting a little show of what the cephalic fins are capable of doing. So this is how they look when they're just moving around. It increases the hydrodynamics of the animal. And then when they're feeding or cleaning, they open up the cephalic fins. And here you see these reef fish swimming right into the mouth to clean. And so because mantas show up to these cleaning stations with some degree of predictability, we know that if we go to a cleaning station, eventually we'll see a manta ray. It makes it a very important research location for us. So most of the work that we do happens at cleaning stations, because we know that if we go to a cleaning station, there will be a manta that comes along and we can snap a photo, take a sample, put on a tag, and so forth. And it also makes a pretty reliable location for tourists to come and dive with mantas. And as a result, mantas are becoming an increasingly valuable resource in ecotourism. So this is an oceanic manta being harassed by a bunch of divers right here, which is good and bad. It brings in a lot of money and makes the species valuable. And for the most part, they tend to enjoy it. So because mantas are very intelligent, very curious, in a lot of places, they actually have these very personal interactions with people. So in the Revillagigedo Islands, which is one of our research sites off of Baja, Mexico, people literally pay millions of dollars to go diving with mantas every year, specifically because they have these really personal interactions where mantas will come up and pay attention to them, take a look at them. And while people also do this with sharks, manta rays don't have big teeth, you don't have to be behind a cage, and you can still play with an animal that's up to 22 feet across, right? So that makes them special, and that makes them really valuable in ecotourism. So from a recent paper published, we know that manta rays bring in about $140 million per year through both direct and indirect tourism value. And so this is really important because what you see here is that in dark blue are the direct dive expenditures. So this is what people are paying to go diving. But there's also a lot of money being pumped into local communities through restaurants, hotels, airfare, and so on. And so manta rays, as a result, are a very valuable species all throughout the Indo-Pacific. And we see here, this is the two species broken down, that both species contribute to this tourism revenue. However, it's not a perfect story, and as with most species in the ocean, manta rays are also valuable in fisheries contexts. And recently around the world, targeted fisheries for manta rays have been cropping up, and specifically they're targeted for their gill rakers. And so these gill rakers are what allow mantas to feed on the zooplankton. It's essentially the filtering mechanism that they're using to feed. And these gill rakers are dried and sent to China, where they're used in a pseudo-remedy. And so far, and I expect forever in the future, there's not going to be any evidence that this pseudo-remedy is actually medically beneficial. It's just cartilage, it doesn't do much. But I've got a quick video for you here that sort of illustrates the problem.
Shop. It sells anything from under the sea, including what we're looking for. Manta gill plates cost $420 a kilogram here, 2.5 times more than in Sri Lanka, and similar to the price of mid-ranged shark fins. Liang Yongchao swears by their medicinal benefits.
嗱，呢啲彭魚菜咧，我哋自細咧細路哥出馬，咁啊當佢出完馬之後咧，就一定要買嚟食嘅。
用什麼方式來準備這種所謂的藥材？
咁咧呢啲可以清熱散毒，可以用佢煲粥煲水嚟飲，亦都可以咧用芫茜水煲佢，愛嚟抹身沖涼。
你怎麼知道分量用多少？
呢啲係民間嘅驗方嘅啫，差唔多嗱呢度咧咁一塊咁啊分2次啊3次咁咯，細路哥小朋友數十年來都係咁噶啦。咁啊大人咧你有暗瘡啊之類咧都可以清熱毒嘅。
這個有中醫的根據嗎？
中醫啦， 好多樣嘢都係早上傳落嚟嘅驗方，你話有咩根據啦？咁我真係唔曉講噃。
So that last line there is the important part. And if you were reading the subtitles, you probably noticed that manta gill rakers sort of cure everything, which is a pretty good indicator that they don't really cure anything. And it's probably worth noting that it's not a traditional Chinese medicine. So despite the fact that these traditional Chinese practitioners are prescribing manta gill rakers, they're not in any of these traditional texts that the practitioners use. And they seem to be a relatively recent development. And a lot of people that we work with on the conservation side of things have gone to the source locations for these gill rakers. They've spoken with the middlemen who sell them to the importers in China. And there's pretty good evidence to suggest that these gill rakers are actually sort of serving as a fill-in for shark fins in regions where shark populations are declining so much that shark fins are no longer viable economically. You know, maintaining some level of sensitivity, it's sort of a bogus remedy that's driving these populations most likely into heavy population decline. And so this is just to show you, this is in one dried seafood market in China, in one stall. These are all just bags of gill rakers from manta and mobula rays. So these would probably have come from literally hundreds of mobulas and mantas. And what we know about mantas is that their populations are relatively small. So in regions like Mexico, where there have been photo identification databases for the last 30 years, as few as 300 mantas have been identified. So we know that they're very small populations. We know that they're long-lived. We know that they have few natural predators, and they have very slow population growth rates. And all of these things together make them extremely susceptible to targeted fisheries, and really to any fisheries. But targeted fisheries that are cropping up all over the world are going to have a huge impact. So for the rest of the talk, I'm sort of going to focus on what our research covers, because this fishery, this trade in manta gill rakers is at the core of our research, and it's what's motivating the spatial ecology and the studies that we're doing now. So, so it's just one pup. Yeah, so in one manta ray's entire life, they give birth to fewer pups than a species like the great white shark gives in one litter. And great white sharks are considered extremely susceptible to fisheries, and manta rays are an even more extreme example of that.
The gestation period?
1 year, yeah, every 2 to 5 years. So they could have 10 to 15 pups in their whole lifetime, right? And that's, you know, not factoring in natural mortality and that sort of thing. So the main target of these fisheries are oceanic manta rays, mainly because of where the fisheries exist, and also because reef manta rays tend to have smaller ranges. They're more predictable in their sightings. So regions with big reef manta populations tend to have protections in place to prevent them from being fished, whereas oceanic manta rays don't have such protections in most of the world. So up here we have hotspots, and I'm not going to call them populations because we don't know yet whether or not they're populations, but these are essentially regions where we see lots of oceanic manta rays with some degree of predictability. And so if we overlay the biggest fisheries in the world, and just to give you an idea of the scale, in Indonesia, they're bringing in around 1,000 to 1,300 mantas per year. In Sri Lanka, it's similar, around 1,000 mantas per year, and slightly smaller in India and Peru, as well as artisanal fisheries elsewhere. And so if you compare that, for example, to the database in Mexico, which indicates that there may be as few as 300 to 500 manta rays there, these fisheries are having potentially a devastating impact on populations. So our question, what's motivating our research, is if each of these populations is its own population, it's a distinct population, these fisheries are going to have pretty huge impacts. Whereas if it's a global population, they're going to have different impacts. So we're going to talk about some potential scenarios of connectivity and what that means for fisheries, for tourism, and for the global population. So our first population scenario is a globally mixing, what we call a metapopulation. So this means that the mantas that we see off of Baja are the same as the mantas in Mozambique, and they're just making these trips across the entire Indo-Pacific on a regular basis. And this sounds extreme, but there's actually pretty good evidence to suggest that other species that are similar in size and behavior to manta rays do exhibit this sort of behavior. So whale sharks, there's been no evidence of population structure in whale sharks suggesting that they might actually have this sort of global connectivity. So manta rays are related in many ways to whale sharks. So what does this mean for fishing impacts? So for the global population, this is going to be much worse. So a large fishery in Indonesia is going to impact manta ray populations all around the world. So because it's all one population, the people in Mexico and the mantas in Mexico are going to feel the impacts of fisheries in Indonesia. All right? But this is better for these local fish populations because essentially you're drawing from a larger pool of individuals, so you're not going to have as rapid population decline. And when you do have local depletions in places like Indonesia or Sri Lanka, you have individuals coming from elsewhere to replace the individuals that were removed from the population. So while it's worse for the global population, these local populations are essentially buffered from the impacts to some degree. That's also good for local tourism because this resource, which is bringing in millions of dollars to these local communities, won't disappear as quickly in response to these local fisheries. Now, if we look at the opposite scenario where you have these very isolated insular populations, local fisheries are going to be not as substantial for the global population. So you've essentially got refuge habitats where Mexico isn't seeing the effects of this Indonesian fishery and so on. But it's much worse for these local fish populations for all of the reasons you can imagine. A large fishery here is going to cause this small manta population to crash relatively rapidly. And of course, that's going to remove this tourism resource very quickly, and the local communities are going to suffer. So the true picture of connectivity is probably somewhere in between these two, and that's what we're trying to figure out. How are we going to do this? Well, we're using a variety of techniques, and we're trying to cover as many different spatial scales, so space, and temporal scales, so different time and space scales. And one of our major tools is satellite telemetry, and that's what the majority of my talk is going to be about today. So satellite telemetry is essentially satellite tracking individual manta rays. So we put tags on them, and we get daily location estimates up to a period of about 6 months, so we can see where every single animal that we tag is going. We also use stable isotope analyses. Stable isotopes essentially tell you what an animal is eating. So we can look at differences between populations, and then within a single population we can also look at the importance of different food sources to manta rays and start to come up with some ideas of what critical habitats are and if there are specific areas that we could protect to also protect the species. We're also looking at trace metals. Essentially in the spine casing of an individual manta ray, we have its entire movement record for its whole life up until it was caught in a fishery locked in there. And what we're working on, we're trying to develop a method that lets us look and see exactly where that animal has moved for its entire life and see if there are seasonal movement patterns that are associated with food availability, or if in fact these animals are just traveling across the entire ocean on multi-year scales. And then of course we're looking at genetics. So how genetically related are two populations that are geographically distant, and if there's not a great degree of genetic diversity, it tells us that they probably are mixing, whereas if there's a high degree of genetic diversity, it tells us that on generational scales, they're probably separate populations. So I'll talk about the satellite telemetry specifically today. And at a study site in Indonesia, in the Raja Ampat region, which is an incredibly biodiverse region and happens to have quite a few manta rays. So this is us deploying a pop-up archival satellite tag on a manta. And so what these tags tell us are the depth, the temperature, and the light levels at 1 second increments. And we use that information to pinpoint where the animal was. So it's a pretty neat technology. Based on the day length, we can figure out what latitude the animal's at. And based on the time at noon compared to Greenwich Mean Time, we can see what longitude the animal's at. And then we can narrow that down even further, looking at sea surface temperature. So we put out 3 of these tags last September, and we've since put out quite a few more, but we haven't got data back from them. And we put them out for 6 months to try and answer questions about the regional movements of the species. So what are they doing around Indonesia? How effective are local marine protected areas that have been developed specifically to protect mantas and other sharks and rays? And then, of course, how connected are these mantas with manta populations elsewhere around the world? And what does that mean for fisheries and how susceptible they are to human impacts? And so this is the kind of data we get. So right now we're in Indonesia, and 5 degrees of latitude is about 550 kilometers. So you can see that these animals do travel quite a bit. Each animal traveled about 2,000 kilometers over the course of 6 months. But they're sort of just doing circles. So they're not leaving this area. They never left Indonesian waters. They spent quite a bit of time in this Raja Ampat region. And that's maybe not exactly what we expected. So based on the size of the animal, their pelagic lifestyle, the fact that in other places we can go 18 years between seeing manta rays at one particular site that we monitor. So what are they doing here? Why are they spending all their time in this region? So the first thing you might expect is that there's some sort of food source available that they'd be using. So one of the things we looked at was chlorophyll A concentrations in the region. So chlorophyll A is a proxy for primary productivity, and with primary productivity or phytoplankton, you get zooplankton, which is manta food. So you'd expect that in these high productivity regions, in red and yellow and green, you'd have a lot of manta food, and thus you'd have a lot of manta rays hanging out in those areas. But what we found, and we also analyzed this on daily scales, is that these animals don't seem to be spending too much time in these high productivity regions. So we know they're spending time in this area, but they don't seem to be using their usual food source, which tends to be surface feeding on zooplankton, or at least feeding near the surface. So remember, these tags also tell us what depths these animals were spending their time at. And what we find from that data is that the mantas we tagged are actually spending quite a bit of time very deep. So this is in meters. They're spending the majority of their time between 50 and 100 meters deep, which is really deep. That's below where you tend to see these large zooplankton aggregations and such. And so it begs the question, what are they doing so deep? What are they feeding on, and why are they spending all their time here? So at this region, as elsewhere, we also keep a photo identification database. And what we see from the oceanic mantas in this database is this unusual wearing both on their cephalic fins and also some scarring patterns on their ventral surfaces. And this isn't just on one animal, this is on quite a few animals. So you see these scars essentially on their bellies between their gill slits. And this sort of behavior may be evidence, or this scarring may be evidence of bottom feeding. And we see some bottom feeding in reef manta rays in the Maldives and also in places like Hawaii. And essentially what they're doing is they're swimming along the bottom and they're scraping up the sand and sediment where you have infauna, so other small crustaceans and invertebrates, and feeding on those as they're essentially chased into their mouth. This has never been documented in oceanic manta rays before, but it could be a pretty good indicator for why they're spending their time here. So if there's a benthic resource that's available throughout the year, it doesn't fluctuate with the monsoons, with primary productivity, it could be a pretty good reason to stick around, essentially. So now that we know that they stay in this area and we have a potential mechanism for what's keeping them here, we want to look at how well protected they are. So these polygons pretty much tell you where these two mantas spent the most of their time. So the dark circles are the high use areas, and these ovals in general are pretty much where the animals are spending their time. And when we overlay the Raja Ampat Shark and Ray Sanctuary, which is several 100,000 square kilometers of no-take zone for sharks and rays that was created specifically to protect economically valuable tourism species like manta rays. What we see is that these animals are actually spending quite a bit of time within the marine protected area, which affords a high degree of protection. And that is really important because it means that we may be able to protect the species using what we don't usually use for highly migratory species, which are these marine protected areas. We usually think of using these for reef fish, animals that tend to stay pretty close to home. But it seems like it may be effective for manta rays as well, at least in this region. So the picture that's emerging from this evidence is that manta rays are likely relatively insular in their population structure. So that's negative for these local populations that will be heavily impacted by regional fisheries. It means that there are smaller populations that they're not going to be receiving input from elsewhere. But to sort of mediate that doom and gloom situation, it looks like spatial protections, at least in some regions, could be very effective at protecting the species. And so the data that I just presented to you was also given to the Indonesian government a couple months back, and they've responded really positively, and they're also considering national level protection for both species of manta rays. And we're also doing work in Mexico, Peru, Sri Lanka, similar work tagging stable isotopes genetics to give us a better picture of this global connectivity and whether or not the situation that we're seeing in Indonesia is also what we can expect in other regions, and of course what that means for how susceptible the species is to fisheries and what the best ways to go about protecting them might be. And of course we're doing all of this with the methods that I outlined before, and if you're interested in those, feel free to come talk to me afterwards, but I won't bore the rest of you. And there are lots of people to thank for this, despite the fact that they're extremely large. It may come as a surprise that manta rays can be very hard to find, very hard to study. So there have been a lot of people involved in making that happen, quite a few different people supporting the project, so big thanks to all of them. Big thanks to Birch Aquarium for hosting the lecture, and thanks to all of you guys for your interest and for coming along and learning about manta rays. And with that, we've got plenty of time for questions. Yeah. So the question was what our relationship is with the fisheries where these mantas are landed. And how we use that for research. And the answer is yes, absolutely. And some of our best sample sizes come from the fisheries because we're able to get, unfortunately, quite a few samples, both tissue samples for genetics and stable isotope analyses, and also the spine casings, which are these guys right here, which allow us to do this work. And yeah, it's some of the best sample sizes we have because it's quite a bit harder to find them in the wild and effectively collect samples. The question was, are we finding genetic similarities within fisheries? And the short answer is that in some of the fisheries we're working in Sri Lanka, yes, they're genetically related, but there's also a high degree of diversity, which suggests there may be larger population sizes in these regions that are supporting larger fisheries than in other regions like Mexico. And we're also seeing pretty good convergence with the stable isotopes, which suggests that they're also feeding in the same areas. So the question is, have we been able to identify migratory behavior based off of these photo ID databases? The answer so far is no. So we have made some efforts to sort of cross-compare databases from different regions, and so far we haven't been able to find any matches. It doesn't mean that they're not occurring, but we haven't been able to identify them. And one of the things that we're looking at now is potentially a migratory corridor in Mexico between the Revillagigedo Islands and the mainland. And we're using photo ID to help determine whether or not that's the case, because we're looking at a much shorter distance, smaller geographic area where it might be more effective. But we're also using the tagging and the genetics and all that as well. Yes? Yeah, so the question is, are we able to look at the depth of the ocean, so essentially where the bottom is, compared to the depths of the mantas that we're looking at. And so one of the caveats with the satellite telemetry that we do is that because all of the data has to be transmitted back via satellite, we get pretty coarse scale data. So we can't look at actual dive profiles. We just know about how much time the animal spent in each bin over the course of a whole day. And also within those satellite locations, we've got a pretty decent area of uncertainty. And in regions like Indonesia, where you can have the depth of the water going from a couple meters to a couple thousand meters over just a couple kilometers, it's hard to say with certainty whether or not the depths of the water correspond with the depths that we're seeing. So we're looking into other ways of tracking that with critter cams and things like that to see what the actual behavior is on the bottom. But so far we don't know for sure. Yeah. We're trying to get that up and running, yeah. The season in the Maldives for the vortex feeding, for those of you who want to book a trip, are, I believe it's July to October. And there's a lot of information. You can go to the Manta Trust website and it's all up there, yeah. And we do expeditions as well if you're interested, yeah. So the question is, have we reached out to the diving community to assist with the photo identification of these animals? And the answer is absolutely. So we have a lot of regional partners that we work with. The Manta Trust is sort of a collaboration between lots of independent researchers, and each of those researchers has a really good relationship with the dive shops in the area. And I'd say most of our data for the photo identification comes from divers who've donated their photos. And we actually have a global database now on our website, so anybody can go online and submit their Manta ID photo and give us the date and the location, and all that's input into the database now as well. So if you guys have photos of mantas, you're encouraged to help out. Yes. So the question was just generally about black manta rays. So black mantas are a specific color morph. So the mantas that we've seen photos of this whole time, this is a gruesome photo, sorry, that you've seen photos of, like this guy right here, we call them chevron manta rays. And black mantas, they occur in both species, so they're black reef mantas and black oceanic mantas. And those are a little bit more difficult to identify unless you've done it quite a bit and you're more experienced. But basically, the black morph looks as if you took a chevron manta ray and you grabbed it by its belly and dipped it into black ink, like Achilles. And so you've got all of the same markings between the species underneath the black. So all of the identification tools that we use remain the same. So if you had a black manta ray that was a reef manta, you would still see all of these spots underneath. You just have sort of this black ink over it. And black oceanic and reef mantas look pretty different as well. But yeah, they're still the same species. So you get black and chevron oceanics in the Revihiatos. Yeah. Yes. So the question was about manta conservation. Obviously, there have been huge declines with shark populations, and we're only now starting to get on board with conservation. And what's the situation with manta rays? So there are a lot of problems, of course, but we have had some recent successes. So I think in the lecture that you mentioned, Andy mentioned that 3 species of sharks, I think it was, were all protected on CITES, or all added to CITES Appendix 2. So CITES is the Convention for the International Trade of Endangered Species. And essentially it regulates what species can be traded commercially between countries. So it doesn't protect a species within a country, it just says whether or not a country can export or import any products of that species. And at the same meeting, both species of manta rays were added to CITES Appendix 2. And so that's a big step because it does put in place some regulation of the trade. And of course it's not, except for a couple regions, the fisheries for mantas are not driven by local consumption. It's all driven by the gillraker trade. So it's a good start, but it's not a save-all. It's certainly not the end of the fight to protect the species. So that's been a big success, and now we're trying to sort of ride the publicity that it's developed and go to these countries individually to actually enact protection. Because again, CITES isn't protection, it's just a trade regulation. And so what we really need to do is get individual countries to protect the species within their waters, stop fisheries, and stop bycatch fisheries that potentially impact manta rays. And we're having some success there, mainly because the species is so economically valuable. So there are some places that have already gone and protected mantas and other sharks and rays, like the Maldives has a complete export ban on all sharks and rays, and that is, basically the driver for fisheries. And right now we're trying to support an initiative in Indonesia, which is also one of the major fisheries for mantas, to protect the species, both species nationally. And so far they've been really receptive to it because of the economic value. And places like the Raja Ampat Shark and Ray Sanctuary have really raised awareness about the problem and also about the potential economic value of the species. And so it's unfortunate, but with a lot of marine conservation, it comes down to which of these two activities raises more money. Is it the fishing or is it the tourism? And luckily for mantas in this case, they are way more valuable to tourism than fisheries. So one of the numbers that I didn't have up here is about $140 million are generated by the tourism every year, and only about $11 million are generated by all gillraker trades, and so that includes mobulas. So about half of that is attributed to manta rays. So $140 million versus $5 million is a huge difference. So that's working in our favor, but there's still a lot to do. So the question was, mantas are curious and they approach divers. Are they playful? And I would say yes, that's sort of a subjective thing. But I would say anybody who's dived with a manta would absolutely say yes, they're playful. There are stories, and I've seen it myself, where after you're done playing with the mantas in the water, you get out after your dive and they'll just sit there circling around the boat waiting for somebody to jump back in with them. And so they're really personable. They approach divers, they come in close, they do swim bys over your head. So yeah, I would say they're playful for sure. Yeah. And then another question up here. So the question was, based on the photos that we saw earlier of a manta with a big shark bite taken out of it, which grew back after a year, do they have an innate ability to regenerate? And are there any studies being done on that ability now? So in answer to the first part, yes, absolutely. They are able to heal specific parts of their body. We see quite a bit, actually, this manta right here, one of the cephalic fins, its right cephalic fin, our left, is lobbed off. And that happens with fishing line. So if they get fishing line wrapped around it, it's kind of like cheese wire, and it just gets tighter and tighter and tighter, and then it pops off. And that will never regenerate. So once the cephalic fin is gone, it's gone for good. But we do see very rapid and complete regeneration in the pectoral fins. So it depends on the part of the body that they have that sort of regeneration. But in general, I'd say that they're very hardy, naturally capable of healing quickly after those sorts of traumatic shark bites. As far as I know, there's not any research specifically being done on manta's ability to heal like that, but I can't say for sure. So.
We have time for one more question.
One more question all the way in the back. So the question was, there's an obvious economic discrepancy between the gillraker trade and the ecotourism. So why isn't the problem just sort of, fixed? Because all of us can see that it's way better to have ecotourism as an industry as opposed to fisheries. And this is sort of a problem that we have throughout marine conservation, all the issues. Most things are more valuable either through ecotourism, or if we protect them over the long term, they generate more animals for fisheries. And so why, if it's a no-brainer and we have the science and the economics to support it, why hasn't it been done? And I would say that the main issue is that there are different user groups. So you've got people who are making quite a bit of money off of the ecotourism, but then you also have people who are fishermen who are making money off of the gillrakers, and they're different people. And you've also got middlemen who are buying these gillrakers, and then of course the demand coming from China. And so as long as these two groups are separated, in the fisheries and the tourism trade, it's unlikely that it'll just be an easy fix. And so one of the things that we're really interested in, and we've seen success with this in a lot of places, is converting the people who are making, usually not a very good living off of fisheries to, proponents of ecotourism, people who are making quite a bit of money off of the tourism of these valuable species, and are therefore, supporting the conservation at a local level. And we've had some great success with that in places like Indonesia, again in this Raja Ampat Shark and Ray Sanctuary. All of Raja Ampat is essentially privately managed, and the rangers, the people who go out and ensure that there's no illegal fishing, and also the people who are taking divers out as guides, a lot of them used to be shark fishermen. So there are some places where this works, and there are some places where maybe that capacity just hasn't been developed yet. But I think it's a big question about, everybody says there's more money in tourism, but the question is, how do we get the people who are doing the fishing to get that money from the tourism? Because otherwise, they don't have the incentive to stop fishing. And so that's a big question for marine conservation in general. And one that we're definitely interested in exploring a formula for that for manta rays. So.